I had $3,000 in gold in my saddlebag, the night I learned what a man is worth. And by morning I'd have traded every coin of it for a dry pair of socks, and a reason to believe a kind word could be true. That was the winter I came down through the breaks alone, which any man who knew that country will tell you was a fool's errand for a fool too proud to be told. I was that fool. I'd been Royce Calloway near 40 years by then, and the Long Nine was the biggest cattle outfit between the Salido and the river, and I had got into the habit of believing that the size of a thing was the same as the worth of it. I had got into a great many habits like that. They cost me more than the gold ever did. Let me tell it the way it happened, because the order of it matters. I'd ridden up to Mercy Wells to settle a paper with the bank, and to put a price on a stretch of bottom land I meant to add to my range, and I'd done both, and I was riding home through the high country with my mind on figures, and my collar up against a sky the color of a gun barrel. A wiser man would have gone the long way by the road. I went through the breaks because it was shorter, and because I had never in my life met the thing that could stop me, and a man who has never been stopped comes to believe he can't be. They were waiting in the rocks above the Dutchman's Cut. 3 of them, maybe 4. I never got a true count. The first I knew of it was my horse going out from under me, screaming, and then the cold ground coming up to meet my shoulder, and then nothing I care to set down here except that they were thorough and they were quick. And when they rode off they took the gold and the horse and my good boots and left me the rest. I lay in the rocks a while and listened to my own breath, and to the wind starting to talk in the cut, which is a sound that means snow. I want to be plain about what I felt because it is the start of everything. I was not afraid of dying. I had buried enough people by then that dying had stopped seeming like much of a stranger. What I felt, lying there in the Dutchman's Cut with my money gone and the cold coming into me like water into a boot, was a kind of grim arithmetic. I added myself up. I had a great many dollars I could no longer reach, and a great many men who worked for me, and a fine house with no one in it. And lying in those rocks, I could not for the life of me find the figure that made it come to anything. I had spent 40 years adding, and the sum was a man freezing alone in the rocks where no soul would think to look for him, and not one of them would have come for me without being paid to. I got up because getting up was a habit too. I walked because the cold told me to. I lost the trail and found it and lost it, and the snow came on the way it does in that country, not gentle, sideways and mean, and somewhere in the middle of the dark I stopped being a man with a name and a herd and became only the small, stubborn animal part of me that did not want to lie down. That animal kept its feet on the road by feel. That animal saw the light. It was a low light, yellow, the color a lamp makes through a greased paper window, and it sat off to the left of the road where the land dropped toward a spring, and I went to it the way iron goes to a magnet, with no thought in it at all. I have wondered since what I'd have done if there'd been no light. I expect I'd have walked till I dropped, and that would have been the end of Royce Calloway, and the Long Nine would have been sold off in lots, and not a man in the territory would have grieved me longer than it took to count what I left. That is a hard thing to know about yourself. I knew it that night with the snow in my teeth, and it did not make me kinder. Cold doesn't make a man kind. It just gets him honest. The light was a station. I could make out, as I came up on it, the long, low shape of an eating house and a stable behind and a corral with the rails gone gray, and over the door a board that somebody had painted careful once and not repainted since. Hollow Spring, Meals Beds stock fed. The yard was empty, the kind of empty that has a story in it. I did not have the wit left to read it. I got to the door and I did not knock so much as fall against it, and I heard a bolt go, and the door opened, and there was the light all around a woman, and that is the first I ever saw of Tamsin Ware. I will tell you how she looked because I looked at her a long time after and never tired of it, but that night I could not have told you the color of her eyes. I saw a tall woman in a man's wool coat with a lamp in one hand and the other hand already reaching, and I heard her say, not who are you, not what do you want, but Lord, coming out of it. And then her arm was under mine, which should not have held me and did, and the door shut the storm out behind us, and I went down onto a plank floor in front of a stove, and that was the last of that night I remember clear. What I remember in pieces is this: her hands at my boots, which were not boots anymore but a kind of frozen ruin, and her saying a word under her breath when she got them off and saw my feet. Heat coming into me so painful I'd have wept if I'd had the water in me. Broth held to my mouth and her telling me, low and even, the way you gentle a colt, to take it slow now, just a little slow. A weight of blankets and then a coat laid over the blankets, a heavy coat that smelled of pipe smoke and cedar and a man, and her voice saying to herself, I think, more than to me, that'll do you. That was my father's. He'd want it on somebody. I lay under her dead father's coat, and I waited for the price of it. That is the truth, and I am not proud of it. Some part of me, even half dead, was waiting for the catch. I had not in 20 years received a kindness that did not have a hand out behind it. Men were kind to me because I had cattle and money and the say-so over both. Women had been kind to me for the same. The town was kind to me the way you are kind to a creek you mean to dam. So I lay there and I waited for her to go through my coat for what I had, and ask my name to weigh it and find me wanting. I waited for the bill. It never came. She sat up with me through that whole night. I'd wake and the lamp would be turned low and she'd be in the chair by the stove with a quilt around her and her head back, and then I'd make some sound and she'd be up and her hand would be on my forehead, cool and dry, and she'd say something I couldn't hold and I'd go under again. Once near morning I came up clear enough to talk, and the first thing I said to Tamsin Ware, may God forgive me, was, I can pay you. She was feeding a stick into the stove. She didn't turn around. I expect you can or you can't, she said. Either way you'll get fed. And she shut the stove door on the new flame, and that was the whole of it, and I lay there in the dark and felt something move in my chest that I did not have a word for, and that frightened me worse than the cold had. I told you the cold gets a man honest. Here is the honest thing it got out of me, lying under another man's coat in a failing station on the drover's pike. In 40 years of buying and adding and holding, I had never once been given a thing I had not paid for. And the one time I came to a door with nothing in my hands and nothing to offer, and not even a name worth weighing, a stranger took me in and gave me her last and her dead father's coat, and asked me for not one thing in return. It was the richest I had ever been. I had to lose everything to find it out. The past shut behind me that night. I didn't know it yet, but the storm that near killed me went on 3 days and dropped enough snow in the Dutchman's Cut to close the high road till a thaw, and a man on foot, which is what I was, a man with no horse and feet that needed a week before they'd carry him, was not going anywhere out of Hollow Spring for a good long while. I have thought since that God or luck or the plain mechanics of weather meant to keep me there, until I'd learned the thing I came to learn. I am not a man much given to crediting Providence, but I'll allow that winter had its hand on the scale. When I could stand, I could see the place plain, and the seeing of it told me her story better than she ever did, because Tamsin Ware was not a woman who complained. Hollow Spring had been built by her father to catch the trade off the drover's pike, which in its day was the road every herd and freighter and stage between the Salido and the territory line came up, because of the water. There was a spring under the rock that ran sweet and cold the year round, and a man named Ware had built his station over it, and made it a place where a drover could water his stock, and a freighter could mend a wheel, and any soul on the road could get a hot meal and a clean bed, and if his luck was bad, get it on credit and square up next time through. I learned all this from the place itself, from the worn threshold and the careful mended harness on the wall, and the ledger I had no business reading, but read anyway one afternoon when she was out at the stock, wherein a dead man's careful hand, and then a living woman's plainer one were columns of names, and beside half of them, in place of a figure, the single word paid later or no figure at all, and a small mark I came to understand meant never asked. And it was dying. Anybody with eyes could see it dying. The railroad had come through 40 miles south 2 years gone, and the herds went to the railhead now, and the freight went on the cars, and the stages had quit the pike within the year. The road that had fed Hollow Spring had had its lifeblood drawn off south, and the station sat on a dry vein. There were days that whole first week I was up that not one traveler came to the door. A man or two on the drift, a peddler once, a family in a broke-down wagon she fed and would not charge. The corral that had held 100 head stood empty but for her own 2 milk cows and a mule. The bins were near to bottom. I knew bins. I had filled and emptied 10,000 of them. I knew what the bottom of one looked like, and I knew what it meant. And the woman who had given me the last of her winter beef the night I came had given me a thing she could not spare, and had done it without a flicker. I did not tell her who I was. I want to be honest about why, because it would flatter me to say it was all one clean reason, and it wasn't. Part of it was plain habit. A rich man learns young to keep his fortune off his face the way a card player keeps his hand off his, and I'd kept mine off so long I scarce knew how to set it down. When she asked my name, I said Royce, and I let the rest of it lie. She took it. She didn't pry. She was, I came to learn, a woman who believed a person's business was their own until they cared to make it hers, which is rarer in this world than gold and worth more. But there was another part, and it took me some days to find the bottom of it, and when I did it shamed me and saved me both. The truth was that, for the first time in my grown life, I was being looked at by a person who did not know I was Royce Calloway of the Long Nine, and I found I did not want it to stop. To Tamsin, where I was a beat-up drover who'd been robbed on the road and turned up at her door with nothing, and she fed me and doctored me, and when I was able, set me to earning my keep, and she did all of it the same as she'd have done for any man, and she neither bowed nor scraped nor angled, and I was, in her eyes, just a man. Just a man. I cannot make you understand, if you have never been the richest man in a country, what a thing it is to be just a man. It was like air to somebody who'd been breathing through a rag for 20 years. So I held my tongue, and I earned my keep, and that was where the real trouble started, because a man cannot work alongside a woman like that and not begin, slow, to come back to life. I mended the corral first. My feet weren't fit for much, but my hands were, and there was a stretch of rail down on the south side, and the gate hung crooked on a dragging hinge, and I fixed them because I could not abide a crooked gate, never could, and because doing it gave my hands something to do that wasn't shaking. She came out and watched me a while, leaning on the post with her arms folded, and she said, "You've handled stock." "Some," I said. "More than some, by the way you set that gate." She looked at me the way she had of looking, level and a little amused, like she could see the part of you you thought you'd hid and wasn't going to embarrass you by saying so. "Drover," you said. "Cattle mostly," I said, which was the truest thing I'd told her and the most dangerous. She said, and that was all, and she went back in, and I stood there with my heart going like I was 16, and I cursed myself for a fool, and I fixed her gate. I doctored her milk cow that had gone off her feed, and it turned out to be a thing simple as a stone bruise and a bad tooth, and I drew the tooth and poulticed the foot, and the cow came back, and Tamsin stood in the barn door with the lamp and watched me work and didn't say anything for a long time, and then she said, "My father could have done that. I never learned it. There wasn't time." And there was something in how she said it that told me a good deal about how she'd come to be a woman alone on a dying road with a tooth she couldn't draw, and a dead man's coat she couldn't bring herself to give away, till a stranger came to the door near frozen. She told me the rest of it in pieces, the way I'm telling you, over a week of suppers at the long plank table with the two of us the only ones at it. Her mother gone when she was a girl. Her father her whole world, the two of them running the station, him teaching her the ledger and the cooking and the trade, the road bringing the world to their door every day so that she never felt the smallness of it, never felt poor, was rich in the only way that signifies, which is that she had work she was good at and a man who loved her and a place that was theirs. And then the railroad, and then the road drying up. And then a sow where dying, 2 winters back, of a thing in his chest the doctor in Mercy Wells couldn't name and couldn't stop, and Tamsin burying him out back under the cottonwood, and then opening the station the next morning because there were 2 freighters needing breakfast and her father would not have wanted the door shut. He'd have hated it shut, she said, more than he'd have wanted morning, so I left it open. And she had kept it open, alone, for 2 years, on a road the world had quit, feeding men who could pay and men who couldn't, holding on to a thing everybody had told her to let go of, because letting go of it was letting go of him. I had spent my life accumulating. This woman had spent hers holding on. I did not, until I met her, know there was a difference or which one was worth a damn. And there was the matter of Dent Mowbray. I heard the name before I saw the man. She said it the way you'd say the name of a weather you were watching the sky for. Mowbray had come into the country when the rail did, a smooth, heavy, well-dressed man who'd seen before most that the old road was finished and the men along it were ripe to be plucked. He bought up the dying stations and the failing claims along the pike for a song, paid in cash to folk who needed cash, and he'd been after Hollow Spring for a year. He wanted the spring. Water is the only true wealth in that country. All the rest is just cattle and conversation. And a man who held the Hollow Spring water held the whole of the upper pike whenever the road came back, as such roads do, and Mowbray was a patient man and meant to be holding it when it did. He'd offered Tamsin a price that was 1/4 of what the place was worth and 1/10 of what it meant, and she had told him no, and he had smiled and said she'd come round, the way a man smiles who knows a thing she doesn't. "What does he know that you don't?" I asked her. She was quiet a moment, turning her cup. "My father borrowed," she said finally, "when the road first dried up before either of us would say out loud that it was dying, borrowed against the place to keep it going, thinking the trade would come back. It didn't." She looked at me, and there was no self-pity in it, just the level truth. "Mowbray bought the note off the man my father borrowed from. He holds the paper on Hollow Spring. He's let it ride, because a man like Mowbray would rather you sign than be foreclosed on. It's cleaner, and it salts the ground for the next one he wants. But the day I can't make the payment, he doesn't have to wait for me to come round. He takes it." "When's it due?" "Spring," she said, "1st of April." And she got up and cleared the cups, which was her way of closing a subject, and I sat at the long table in the failing house, and did a piece of arithmetic I'd never done before, which was the arithmetic of what it would cost to break Dent Mowbray across my knee, and found I wanted to do it more than I'd wanted anything in a long time, and I had to sit on my hands, because to do it I'd have had to be Royce Calloway, and I was not ready to stop being just a man. There is a way 2 people fall toward each other when there's no name on it yet, and it is mostly made of small things, and I will not pretend I can lay every one of them out for you, because half of them I only knew were happening after they'd happened. But I'll give you the shape of it. It was the work first. We fell into it together the way 2 people will who both know how, without much talk, each taking the end of a thing the other had hold of. We dug out the spring house that had silted up. We pulled the frozen mule out of a drift it had got itself wedged in, the 2 of us hauling on the rope and laughing. I remember the laughing. I remember being startled by my own, when the fool animal came loose all at once and sat us both down in the snow. We patched the stable roof in a break in the weather, me on the ridge passing down the bad shakes and her below sorting the good from the split, and we got it done by dark and stood in the yard looking up at it with the cold coming on and the first stars out, and she said, "My father would be glad of that roof." And I said, "He'd be glad of you." And she looked at me quick and didn't answer and went in, and I stood in the yard a while longer than the work called for. It was the suppers, the long table that had fed 100 and the 2 of us at the end of it, and the lamp, and the talk that started practical and wandered. I told her things I had not told a living soul, not the figures, I held those, but the rest. About my wife, Eleanor, dead 11 years of a fever fast, before I'd had the sense to know what I was losing, and about how I'd thrown myself into the herd after because the herd was a thing I could grow, and a wife was a thing I couldn't get back, and about how somewhere in the growing of it I'd shut a door in myself I'd forgot was there until a storm blew me up against another. I didn't say all that last part out loud, but I think she heard it. She had a way of hearing the part you didn't say. And she told me about being a woman alone in a country that had no slot to put her in. "They've a word for me in Mercy Wells," she said one night, not bitter, just flat. "Old maid, spinster where, holding her dead daddy's empty house." She turned her cup. "I had offers when I was younger and the road was rich. Good men, some of them, but it would have meant the station, you see, meant leaving it or them coming to it and it becoming theirs and me the woman who cooked in it. And I couldn't. It was the only thing that was mine. So I stayed and the road died and the offers stopped, and now I'm the joke of the county, the woman who held on to nothing." She looked up at me. "You think I was a fool?" "No," I said, and I meant it down to the floor. "I think you're the only person I ever met who knew the price of a thing and the worth of it both, and knew they're not the same, and chose the worth." I'd spent 40 years on the price. I didn't say that either, but I think she heard it. It was, in the end, one particular afternoon. A family came up the road in the worst of it, a man and his wife and their young ones, 4 of them, in a wagon with a cracked tongue and a played-out team, fleeing some failure further north, headed for some hope further south, the way half the people on a frontier are always going. They had no money. The man said as much before he'd take the harness off, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands and his pride in his teeth. Said it straight out. "We can't pay, but the children, ma'am, if there was bread." And I watched Tamsin Ware look at that man and his wife and his children, and I watched her do the arithmetic I knew now she did, the bins near bottom, the note due in spring, the cold cost of every loaf, and I watched her not do it, watched her wave it off her face like smoke and say, "There's beds and there's supper. Bring them in out of it. You can mend the tongue in the morning and that'll be square." And she fed those people from stores she could not spare. And she put the children by the stove and gave them the good blankets. And when the littlest one, a girl no higher than the table, fell asleep over her bowl, Tamsin carried her to the bed and stood looking down at her a minute with a thing in her face I have not the skill to set down. I was at the end of the table and I was, I will tell you plain, undone. I had given away money in my life. I had built a church in Mercy Wells and put my name on it. I had never once given a thing it cost me to give. And here was a woman with the bottom of the bin in sight giving away the last of her bread to people she'd never see again and would never be paid by. And doing it not as charity, with the giver up high and the took from down low, but as a plain matter of how the world ought to run, that a soul cold on the road gets brought in. And that's all, that's the whole of it. That's what a door is for. Her father's whole life was in that ledger word, never asked. And I sat there at the long table and I understood, finally, sitting still as a stone, that I had it exactly backward my whole life. I'd thought you held a thing by keeping it. She held everything she had by giving it away. The road had quit her and the world had named her a fool, and she was, of every soul I'd ever known, the only one who was truly rich, because there was nothing in this world that could make her poor. That was the night I knew I loved her, and the night I knew I'd waited too long to tell her the truth, and the 2 pieces of that knowledge sat in me like a stone and a coal, and I did not sleep. Because here is the trap I'd built for myself, and I built it brick by brick out of my own habits, and I deserved every wall of it. I had spent 20 years sure that no one wanted Royce Calloway, only the Calloway herd. I had got hard and shut and lonesome on that certainty. And then I'd come to a door with no herd and no name, and a woman had loved the man and not the fortune, had fed the man, had sat up with the man, I let myself believe, beginning to lean toward the man the same slow way I was leaning toward her. And the longer I let her think I was a beat-up drover, the surer I could be that it was the man she wanted. I see now that I was hoarding her regard the way I'd hoarded everything else, holding it close, afraid that the truth would change the count. But it could not hold. A lie like that is a thing you rent, not own, and the rent comes due. And worse than the lie was what sat behind it, that when she learned I was the richest man in the territory, One of two things would happen, and I dreaded them both. Either she'd change toward me, start to weigh me, angle, the way every other soul had, and I could not have borne that to see her become like the rest. Or she'd think I'd been laughing at her the whole time, the rich man playing poor in the poor woman's house, taking her last beef and her father's coat as a kind of sport, and she'd never forgive it, and she'd be right not to. There was no door out of that lie that didn't cost me her. And so, like a coward and a rich man, which I have learned are frequently the same animal, I kept not telling her, day on day, while the snow held and the bins went lower and the 1st of April came on like a slow tide. I had reckoned without my own outfit. I should have known. A man does not vanish off the Mercy Wells Road with 3,000 in gold and a horse worth 200 and have his foreman shrug and sell the cattle. Cobb had been with me 22 years. He was a hard, close-mouthed, loyal old devil, and when I didn't turn up at the Long Nine within the day they expected, he put men on the road, and when they found my horse run off and found, by and by, the sign of the thing in the Dutchman's cut after the first thaw, he did not, as I'd have grimly bet, count me a dead loss and a good riddance. He hunted me. He hunted me for the better part of a month through the worst weather that country had seen in years, working the road station to station, asking after a missing cattleman, and I did not know it, sitting warm and lying in Tamsin Ware's eating house, falling in love and dreading the spring. They came on a bright hard morning at the start of the thaw, the snow going to mud in the yard, the icicles dropping off the eaves. I was at the corral working a green colt of Tamsin's on a long line, gentling it, the way I'd gentled 1,000, taking my time, and she was on the porch with a basin, and we were neither of us talking, just easy in the morning the way we'd got, when I heard horses on the pike. A lot of horses. And then they came up over the rise, 8 or 10 riders coming hard, and at the head of them a square old man on a roan I'd have known in the dark. And I stood there in the corral with the line in my hand, and the bottom went out of the morning. Cobb saw me when he was still 50 yards off. I watched him see me. I watched 22 years go across that hard old face all at once, the relief and the fury both, the way a man looks when a thing he'd grieved comes walking back. He put the spurs to the roan and came on and pulled up at the corral rail in a slather and was down off the horse before it stopped. And he had me by both arms. This man I had never once seen lay a hand on a soul, and he was saying, "Mr. Calloway, God Almighty, Mr. Calloway, we'd near give you up." And behind him the riders were pulling up and pulling off their hats, every man of them, and saying it, that word, that name, into the bright thawing morning. "Mr. Calloway, Mr. Calloway, the boss, he's alive." And I turned because I could not help it, and I looked at the porch. Tamsin stood with the basin still in her hands. She was looking at the riders and at Cobb gripping my arms and at me, and I watched her hear it. Mr. Calloway, the Long Nine, the boss, watched her take it in and turn it over and understand it, the whole of it, in about the time it takes a thing to fall. I watched the easiness go out of her face, not into anger first, into something worse than anger, into a kind of careful blankness, a drawing in, a door shutting that I'd had open a month and hadn't valued near enough. She set the basin down on the porch rail, slow and even, and she stood there with her hands empty, and she looked at me across that muddy yard, and she said in a voice pitched just to carry, level as ever, "Royce Calloway." Not a question. A name being weighed at last and found to be a different thing than she'd thought. "Tamsin," I said. I came toward the porch. Cobb let go of me. The whole yard had gone quiet. "Tamsin, let me." "The Long Nine," she said. "Richest outfit on the Salido." She nodded slowly, more to herself than to me, fitting the pieces. "Robbed in the breaks. I did wonder why a drover'd be carrying enough to be worth robbing." Her mouth made a shape that wasn't a smile. "You weren't a drover at all." "I handle cattle," I said, which was a fool thing to say, and I knew it as it left me. "You own them," she said. "You own everything." And there it was, not the anger I dreaded, but the thing under it, the hurt I'd known would come and had no right to be surprised by. "And you let me give you my father's coat." I have stood in front of a good many hard things in my life. Standing in that muddy yard in front of Tamsin Ware's face was the hardest, because I could see, plain as the thaw, exactly what she was thinking, and it was the very thing I dreaded, and it was worse. She was thinking that the rich man had played poor in the poor woman's house, that she'd been a fool twice over, first to hold a dead road, now to open her heart to a man who'd been laughing behind it. She was thinking of the last of the beef, and the bins gone low, and the bread she couldn't spare given to a man who could have bought the whole station with what fell out of his pockets, and never said. I watched the joke of the county close over her like cold water, and I'd handed it to her myself. It wasn't a game, I said. The whole yard was listening. I didn't care. Tamsin, it was never. You should ride on, Mr. Calloway, she said. Your men have been worried. And she picked the basin back up, because clearing a thing was how she closed it, and she went inside, and the door shut, and the bolt went, and I stood in the yard in the mud with 10 of my own men staring at me, and not one of them with the first idea of what to do, which made 11 of us. Cobb found me an hour later out behind the station at the Cottonwood, where I'd gone because there was nowhere else to go, and because that was where a Ware was buried, and I had a thing to say to him whether he could hear it or not. I'd said it. I won't write it here. It was between me and a dead man and his daughter's locked door. Cobb came up and stood a respectful piece off and didn't speak, the way he did, until I was ready. You want to tell me what happened to you, Mr. Calloway, he said finally. Not a question either. Cobb didn't ask questions. He gave you the room to answer. So I told him. The breaks, the robbery, the storm, the light. The woman who'd taken me in with nothing and given me her last and asked for not one thing in return. And as I told it, standing there in the mud by the dead man's grave, I heard the shape of my own story out loud for the first time, and I heard what it was. It was the story of a man who'd been given the one true thing of his life for free, and who'd repaid it with a lie because he didn't know how to receive a gift without suspecting it. I told Cobb the whole of it, and at the end of it I said, and there's a man named Dent Mowbray holds the note on this place, and it's due the 1st of April, and he's going to take it and the spring under it and turn that woman out onto the road her father built. I looked at my foreman. Cobb, what do I own? He blinked at me. Sir. What do I own? Everything. Give me the figure. He gave it to me. It was a large figure. I had spent 40 years making it large. And standing by a Ware's grave with the thaw running off the brim of my hat, I finally understood what the figure was for. Not for adding to, for this. Get back to the long 9, I told him. I want to know who Mowbray borrowed from to buy up this country and what he owes and to whom, and I want it by the 1st of April. A man who buys cheap is a man who's leveraged, Cobb. I'd bet my hat on it. Men like that are never as rich as they hold themselves out to be. They're just early. Find me the paper behind the paper. Cobb's hard old face was beginning, very slowly, to do a thing I'd seen it do maybe 3 times in 22 years, which was to come close to a smile. And find me whatever Dent Mowbray's done that won't bear daylight, because a man who forges a patient face over a greedy one has done a dozen things that won't, and I want every one of them. Yes, sir, said Cobb, and he was grinning now outright, the old devil, because he'd worked for me 22 years and he'd never once seen me go to war over anything but profit. And here I was going to war over a woman with a locked door, and I believe it pleased him down to his boots. And the woman, sir. I looked at the station, at the smoke from the stovepipe going up straight now in the still thawing air. The woman, I said, I have to do different. The money's the easy part, Cobb. I've always known how to spend money. I never once in my life knew how to be given something. I have to learn it in about 3 weeks, and I'm a slow study, and the teacher's not speaking to me. I picked up my hat. Leave me a horse and a week's pay and ride. And Cobb, he stopped. Don't a man of you breathe a word of charity in Mercy Wells. Don't you go round telling the country the long 9's saving the Spinster station. That ruin it surer than Mowbray would. You understand me? I don't, sir, said Cobb, honest as ever, but I'll do it. You will someday, I said. I did not ride. I went and stood on the porch where she could see me through the greased paper window, and I waited, because I'd run out of clever and all I had left was the truth and the willingness to stand in the cold for it. It took till near dark. Then the bolt went, and the door opened the width of her face, and Tamsin Ware looked out at me and she said, "You're letting the heat out standing there." "I'll stand here till April if I have to," I said. "That's a long time to stand." "I've a lot to stand for." She looked at me a while. The hurt was still in her, I could see it, but under it she was, above all things, a fair woman, and fair women will hear you out even when they'd rather not, because fairness in them runs deeper than hurt. "Say it then," she said, "out here where I can shut the door on it if I don't like it." So I said it. I'd had an hour by a grave to find the words, and I'd found them, and I gave them to her straight. No figures, no smoothness, the plainest I ever talked in my life. I told her I'd lied about who I was, and that the lie was a coward's, but I told her why, that I'd been the richest man in the territory long enough to forget what it was to be looked at as a man, and that she'd looked at me as a man, fed the man, sat up with the man, and that I'd held on to that the way a drowning fool holds a plank, too scared to let it go even to save us both. I told her I had not been laughing. I told her that the last of her beef and her father's coat were the only things I'd ever been given in my grown life that I hadn't paid for, and that they'd shown me I'd been a poor man in a rich man's clothes for 20 years, and that she was the richest soul I'd ever met and I the poorest, and that if she shut the door on me she'd be right to, but she'd be shutting it on the only true thing that had ever come up her road. She was quiet a long time. The dark came down around us, and then she said, "Lo, why didn't you trust me with it?" And that was the whole of it, wasn't it? That was the wound under the wound. Not that I was rich, that I hadn't trusted her. "Because I'd never met a soul I could," I said. "And by the time I'd met one, I'd forgot how. I'm asking you to teach me. I'm a slow study, Tamsin, but I learn what I'm set to." She looked at me through the dark a moment more. Then she opened the door the rest of the way. "You'll catch your death out there," she said. "Come in. Supper's cold, but it's there." And I went in, and that was not the end of it, but it was the turn of it, and I have been grateful every day of my life since for a door that opened the second time. I will not pretend it was easy after, because it wasn't, and the easy version isn't worth the telling. She did not melt because I'd made a pretty speech. She let me back into the work and the suppers, but careful, watching, the way you'd watch a colt that had thrown you once. And the hardest thing, the thing it took us the rest of that thaw to settle, was the very thing I'd been so sure I knew how to do, the money. Because of course I wanted to fix it. I wanted to ride to Mercy Wells and pay off Mowbray's note and tear it up in front of her, and I said so. And she said no, flat. And I didn't understand, and we had the first real fight of our lives over it, standing in the empty corral with the mud drying. "Take it from him and hand it to me," she said, "and then it'd be yours. You'd own the spring and the station and the road, and I'd be the woman you let stay on. I'd have traded one man holding my paper for another. I held this place alone for 2 years, Royce. I didn't hold it to be saved at the end like a girl in a story." Her chin was up and her eyes were bright, and she had never in her life looked finer. "I won't be a thing you bought, even a thing you bought kind. Not even from you. Especially not from you." And I, who had bought everything I'd ever had, stood in that corral and understood at last, and all the way down, the thing she'd been teaching me since the night I came to her door. That there is a kind of giving that takes, and a kind that frees, and the difference is whether the one you give to ends up standing taller or standing in your shadow. I'd meant to save her. She was telling me that being saved is just another word for being owned, and she'd sooner lose the station to Mowbray standing up than keep it from me on my knees. So we did it different, and we did it her way, and it was better, and it was the proudest piece of work of my life. What Cobb dug up was what I'd bet on and worse. Dent Mowbray was leveraged to his collar. He'd bought up half the dying pike on borrowed money, betting the road would come back and he'd hold the water when it did, and he was carrying more paper than he let on, and the men he carried it to were getting nervous. That was the lever. And the daylight thing, The thing that wouldn't bear it was the note itself. Cobb's men, working quiet, turned up the man Asaware had truly borrowed from, an honest old freighter named Bell down at the territory line, and Bell's own record of the loan, and it did not match the note Mowbray held. Mowbray had bought a small, honest debt, and then, somewhere between Bell's hand and his own strongbox, the figure on it had grown, and the terms had hardened, and Asaware's plain mark at the bottom had been made to cover a thing Asaware never signed. It was forgery, plain and provable, and it was the kind of thing that, brought into the light in front of the right people, doesn't just void a note. It ends a man in a country where a man's word is the only bank that never fails. So here is how the 1st of April went at Hollow Spring, and I'll tell it the way it deserves, because it was Tamsin's day and not mine. Mowbray came up the pike in a fine buggy with a clerk and a deputy, the way such men do, dressed for a foreclosure, smooth and heavy and sure. He'd heard, I think, only that the Spinster had a man about the place now, some drover, and he'd come to enjoy himself a little. He had the note in a leather folder. He did not, when he stepped down into the yard, recognize me, because the last time Dent Mowbray had thought about Royce Calloway had been a name in the bank in Mercy Wells, not a lean, weathered man in a borrowed coat leaning on a corral rail at a dying station. But the yard was not empty. That was Tamsin's doing and mine, and it was the part I'd been told to keep quiet and the keeping quiet was the whole trick of it. Because the day before, riders had begun to come up the pike, not my men, or not only mine, but freighters and drovers and the families along the road. Old Bell himself come up from the line with his records in a saddlebag, and the people Tamsin Ware had fed for 2 years and never charged. The never-asked column of a dead man's ledger come walking up the road on its own 2 feet, because word had gone out, quiet, the way true word does. That Spinster Ware was in a fix, and the door that had always been open to them might shut. They filled her yard. Not riders I'd hired, riders she'd fed. By the morning of the 1st of April, the corral I'd mended held 40 head of other men's stock watering at her spring for the first time in 2 years, and the long table had fed 30 people breakfast, and the yard of Hollow Spring was full of life for the first time since the road died, and not $1 of mine had bought a soul of it. It was the kindness coming back. It had gone out, loaf by loaf, year on year, into a country that the world said had no use for her, and on the 1st of April it came home all at once, the way a thing flung hard comes back when it strikes the right wall. Mowbray stood in the middle of all that, and his smile got careful. He read the room the way such men can. And then Tamsin Ware came down off her porch, with old Bell beside her and Bell's records in her hand, and she did not need me at all, and that was the finest thing of the whole fine day. She faced Mowbray in her own yard in front of the whole road, and she laid the true loan beside his false note, and Bell named the figure he'd lent her father, and the day he'd lent it. And the difference between Bell's word and Mowbray's paper hung in the bright air for every soul to see. And the deputy, who was an honest enough man caught in a bad errand, took the note out of Mowbray's hand and looked at it and looked at Bell's record and went a shade of gray. Because forgery is a hanging country's hard word, and he was holding the rope. Mowbray tried, of course. Men like that always try. He blustered and he threatened and he turned at the last, smooth as ever, to offer to tear the note up himself and call it a misunderstanding and ride off square. And that was when I stepped off the rail and crossed the yard, and he looked at me, this drover, and I said, "My name's Royce Calloway, the Long Nine. I believe you're carrying paper to the Drovers' Bank in Mercy Wells and to 2 houses on the Salido, and I believe those houses would take a powerful interest in learning their man signs other men's names. You'll tear that note up, Mr. Mowbray, and then you'll get in your buggy. And then you'll be gone from this country by the time the cottonwoods leaf, and you'll go quiet, and you'll go grateful, because the lady," and I looked at Tamsin, and she was looking at me, and there was the easiness back in her face at last, with something new behind it. "The lady is being merciful, and merciful is more than I'd be." He tore it up. He got in his buggy. He was gone from the country before the cottonwoods leafed and he went quiet, and I'd like to say I never thought of him again, and mostly that's true. No shot was fired in Tamsin Ware's yard that day, and no blood spilled. A crooked man was undone by daylight, and an honest woman was left standing taller than she'd stood in 2 years, in her own place, holding her own paper, saved by the only fortune that ever truly compounds, which is the kind you give away. That was Tamsin's day. The money, my money, came after, and it came her way, and here is how, because it matters that you understand it wasn't a rescue. The road did not come back on its own, roads don't, but the long nine made a road. I had 2,000 head a year going to the railhead, and I had been sending them the south way out of habit and ease, and there was no earthly reason but habit they shouldn't go up the pike past Hollow Spring, watering at the sweet cold spring under the rock, fed and bedded at the station, the drovers eating at the long table and paying full coin, because Tamsin Ware would no more take charity from her husband's outfit than from a stranger, and I had learned by then not to offer it. Where the long nine watered, other outfits followed, the way cattle and men both do, and within 2 years the drover's pike was a living road again, not because a rich man saved a poor woman, but because two people who'd each been holding on to the wrong thing learned to put their holdings together, her place and her spring and her open door, and my herd and my reach and at long last my trust, and made a thing that fed them both and a whole country besides. Her yard filled with riders. It stayed full. The bins were never near the bottom again, but she fed the man who couldn't pay just the same as ever, never asked, and now there was always plenty, and I came to see that this, and not the herd, and not the figure Cobb had given me by the grave, was what wealth had been for the whole time, and I'd had to lose every dollar of it in the Dutchman's cut to learn it from a woman the county called a fool. We married under the cottonwood, with a sow close by in the spring when the road was greening. It was a small wedding and a plain one, and there has not been a richer day in my life. I'll not set down what passed between us that's between us. The Bible of my heart on that is closed and stays closed, the way the worth of such things is kept by keeping them. But I'll tell you the last of it, because you'll want to know, and because it's the only ending I've got, and it's the true one. I kept her father's coat. I never wore it, it was a saz, and a thing like that isn't yours to fill. But I kept it on the peg by the door at Hollow Spring all the long years we ran the place together. And there were drovers and freighters, and lost families beyond counting who came up that living road and got fed and bedded, and if their luck was bad, got it on credit and never asked. And a good many of them never knew the lean old man who ran the station with his wife had been the richest cattleman in the territory. Because he didn't tell them, and not for the old coward's reason anymore, but for a better one. Because at Hollow Spring a man was just a man, came to the door just a man, got taken in just a man, and that was the whole of the wealth of the place, and we guarded it like the spring it was. I am old now, telling this, and Tamsin is gone 3 years, under the cottonwood beside her father where I'll lie to before long, and the road's hers and her father's and mine, and it'll be the territory's after, which is as it should be. People ask me sometimes, the young ones who have heard I was a great cattleman once, what's the secret of getting rich, and they want the figure, the trick, the cold arithmetic I spent the first half of my life on. And I tell them the truth, which they never believe, being young and sure the way I was sure, that I was the poorest man in the territory the day I had 3,000 in gold, and the richest the night I had nothing but another man's coat and a woman's open door, and that the only fortune I ever saw return, sure as a thing flung hard comes home, was the kind given away by a woman everybody but me had named a fool. She fed a frozen stranger her last and asked nothing, and it came back to her 100-fold, and the largest part of what came back was me beaten, broke and good for nothing yet, the worst bargain she ever made and the only one she never once regretted. A man's worth, I learned at her table, is not what he keeps. It is what comes home to him when he's gone and given everything away. By that account, and only that one, I died a wealthy man.